Hey, welcome to the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. We're trying to help you win your fantasy football drafts. And this is lesson 88, positional targets, part 5. We're going to look at the tight ends the next 3 lessons. I covered the running backs previously here. And we're trying to get a sense of what the targeting may B for 2021. We need to look in the past to try to consider the future, I believe is how we approach this. And again, this is my process, and that's the whole point of the video lessons, show you what I do. So we're doing tight ends, and we're looking at 2015 to 2020. And I was interested in weeks 1 to 17 and was curious about the 6-year trends. I was curious about the ends, the middles, the beginnings of targets. In other words, is there a league process where tight ends start off slow but they end fast, or some other type of pattern? And so I developed, or did this metrics here. This is all tight ends that had a target. I gathered their targets for each week and gave an average, and then I colorized green as high and red is low. And I think you can see right away that 2015 and 16 were much better years for tight end and targeting than last year. Okay, and even the year before and the year before that, and maybe even the year before that. So it's been a very interesting situation. I don't necessarily have an explanation. I'm just, here's the data. How can we use it, for consideration of 2021? And whatever's been going on, the targeting of tight ends has certainly decreased over the last 6 years, and it may be due to more tight ends being present, right? If you have more tight ends that are collecting targets, then your average is going to go down. So that's one possibility, is teams are having more of a platoon of tight ends getting targets. So I'm going to kind of keep that in the back of my head. So what that would mean, I think, for 2021 then would be that tight ends that got a lot of targets would be even more of value than maybe previous years where there were, say, lesser tight ends, right? So the highly targeted tight ends would be of more consideration and value. So I developed trend lines, and we looked at tight end targets, TGTs, versus season, and each week, week 1 to 17, from 15 to 20. And I plotted all the averages, and I just really focused on the last 2 years and the grand average over the last 6. And the grand average is the polynomial trend line here, which is fairly flat. So over 6 years, the pattern has been pretty much no change from week 1 to week 17. That's fine. It can be that way. I have no stake in that. The blue trend line is from 2019, and the green trend line is 2020. And what I will say is there seems to be an exaggeration of targets, a trend going up in our fantasy football playoffs towards the end. Don't know if that's wide receivers, running backs breaking down. Not sure what's going on there. Just showing you what the trend was that I'm looking at here. There, so it's just good to know going into the playoffs the last 2 years, the average number of targets on the tight ends has increased. So that could be of interest in your trades and other kinds of daily fantasy sports plays later in the season. Just kind of keep that little factoid in the back. The yellow or the preceding years, 2015 to 18, I didn't want to have so many lines there. I really wanted to focus on the last couple and the average. So the average says there's nothing going on, and the last 2 years actually show an increase at the end, and maybe even a little bit of higher targets in the early rounds, and a little bit of decrease in the middle. Not sure we can make that full, uh, uh, con, full opinion on that, but that's could be what it's telling us. But it's clear that, and even if you look at the average, and that's the orange, you see a little bit of increase. And I think that's just been, uh, above average the last 2 years, weeks. Certainly 15, 16, 17, maybe 14, somewhere in there. So let's look at variation within the week within the tight end populations. Okay, variation. The more variation, the higher the variation, the more uncertainty that we have for any one player in that population here. So here's the polynomial average here in red. So we see a little bit of a tendency for an increase, and the variation increases and then drops. So you have a lot more uncertainty in the middle part of the season, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if that bye week's playing into that, but there's a little more uncertainty here. So just be aware versus early and late. I think what that's saying is early, there's probably the tight ends that have shown the success in the past are given more consideration, and then maybe other tight ends come in later in the season. And I think by the end, teams are pretty much using who's working at that point. So I don't think they're taking any gambles towards the end here. And so I think that's how we could interpret that, is at variation. So just be aware in daily fantasy sports, there's that tendency to have a lot more variation in the middle of the season. So a little tricky with your tight ends. You might get a little more conservative in your picks than you have a little bit more or less uncertainty early and late. So it's just something to consider if you're a daily fantasy sports person. So here is the tight ends, and I looked at teams over the last 6 years, and I give you the average of total targets that the teams received over the 6 years. The average of the scale targets, that's to the league average. So we can have a number, but what does that number mean to the average? So the average is 31 targets per season per team. And so if you scale that, we can see that Kansas City, we can see that Philadelphia, we can see that Las Vegas, San Francisco, the Rams, Carolina, Washington, Indiana, those have done well over uh, the league here over the 6 years, something to consider. And I figured out average targets per game and sorted the whole team from high to low over the 6 years. And the average is about right here. Okay, so about right there. So it cuts right there. So I colorized the teams' names. The teams that had the highest average tight end targets were in green, and the ones that the lowest over the 6 years now is in red. So, and then you can use the other data, but I have an interest about how there's been, use over the 6 years. And notice Atlanta, for instance, is number 2. So they drafted the new rookie, and I think he's getting a lot of play because Atlanta has been pretty good in average of targets per game over the 6 years. The Jets have been, hadn't been successful recently. Chicago has been, Cincinnati, Kansas City, Dallas. So I think, for instance, the Dallas tight ends are being underplayed a little bit. And of course, Kelsey from Kansas City. So consider, the patterns here for 2021. Okay, let's move. So looking at a visual 2015 to 20 average total should be tied in. So it's bad on my part here. That's tied in. Targets. Scaled targets and targets per game. Showing the highs and the lows here. And the average total targets, look at Philadelphia over the 6 years have done quite amazing. Look at Kansas City, the Raiders with Waller, Baltimore with Andrews, Indianapolis, Washington's looking good with Thomas. So I think if you draw a circle around some of the top teams over the 6 years, they tend to be the teams in 2021 that have some of the highest rated tight ends going by ADP. So there, people say, "Oh, we shouldn't pay attention to last year." Well, isn't it interesting that the team trends over the 6 years seem to fall with the ADPs? And if you look at the scaled, you can see how that compares over the 6 years averages. Here's some of the high ones here. Anything above 0 is notable here. Okay, so just keep your eyes open. So there's nothing that's probably a total surprise here. The one that I do note that is a surprise, Carolina has really fallen off the wagon over the time. And but the rest of them, yeah, it looks pretty good. I'm just looking at the data here. Yeah, it looks okay. Jacksonville sucks. Arizona has not used their tight ends, and the Jets have really declined, as well as Seattle, Cleveland. New England's gone, and Tampa Bay has not used their tight ends as well over 6 years. I know last year was changing, but just take a look at the 6 year trends here. So I would be cautious about teams that didn't have some type of trend over the last 6 years, if you're picking tight ends there. So let's focus on the last 2 years and see what has changed or not changed. This is the team, the 2019-2020, the differences and the average team targets. And I sorted by differences. In other words, I sorted by teams that seem to have improved in 2020. There they are, versus teams that had declined. I guess I need to draw this in yellow here. There you go. So declining teams. Indianapolis worries me. The Chargers, they got cooked, but they, I mean, it wasn't too bad in 2020, but they definitely declined. And even Chicago was high, but still declined. So notice some of the declining teams here. And what do you think that means for 2021? And, how does that focus all that attention there? It's not as clear cut as I love the metrics to be. I'm going to be honest with you. You have to pick and choose your marks. And but I do favor Washington, of course, Kansas City. Tennessee might surprise this year. New Orleans could surprise. People are sure counting on that. And the Raiders, those had a nice increase in 2020. But again, Arizona, Carolina, New England, they did increase, but not have concerns about this year. They're not showing me what I need to see. Maybe I'm a little too conservative here, and that might be the case. So here is a grand way to look at it, and on this side of the graph, teams that had 2020 greater than 2019. Here's teams 2019 was higher than 2020 here. And then here's the differences here. And notice here is the 0 point, kind of about right there. So here's teams that clearly had exceeded last year, their 2019. Take a look at Washington. Their 2019 was here. Boy, they really woke up with Logan. I do like to see that. New England did wake up a little bit, but trouble is they grabbed two, Smith and Hunter Henry. I'm not sure how that's going to play. I would be cautious. Here's Kansas City. That looks good. Arizona increased, but I was still underwhelmed by how their 6 years in 2019 was kind of sucky. Carolina, same thing. Not happy with them. Tennessee, I think they may surprise this year. And if you look at Las Vegas, they were higher, but still, if you take a look across at all the teams with the higher yellow, that was 2020. Vegas wasn't the top as well. So kind of use some common sense here to see what's going on. But, I would be concerned Grosicki in Miami, that I've been drafted him as my tight end 2 in best ball, but I do see this. I really was hoping they can get back to 2019. So that's a gamble. Noah Fant, I'm a gambling. Philadelphia, gambling again. So a lot of the gambles I have this year, not for my tight end 1s, but for tight end 2s, I'm actually picking teams that had a great 2019 but really sucked last year. And that's probably why they're available as tight end 2s as well. So maybe there's just there's the wisdom of the crowd no more than us reading the metric a little bit. Sometimes the public is right as a group. So that's why they call it the wisdom of the crowd. Okay, I think that's my first lesson for tight ends. We saw some interesting uh, teams. There's some that I had concerns about, some that I didn't have concerns about. This year I'm either taking an early tight end or I'm gambling with some later ones here. I'm not kind of picking in the middle so much. And I think a lot of people are doing that as well for their overall strategy. Okay, come back. This is the end of the tight end lecture. Was it 88? Yep, video lecture 88. Come back. This is the process.